Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this Fireside Chat with Stani Kulechov, founder and CEO of Avara, which supports Aave Labs and the decentralized social networking protocol, Lens. And we are going to be discussing Lens and decentralized social. So, Stani, you created Aave, which is the biggest DeFi lending protocol. What inspired you to focus next on social media? What problem are you trying to solve with it?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing, maybe it comes a little bit from my kind of a journey into Web3, because then the first use cases I saw with blockchain were very much related to finance and maybe also for the nature what blockchain tried to actually solve in the first place, peer-to-peer transactions without middlemen. With Bitcoin and then with Ethereum having a programmable machine that enabled actually create other types of financial use cases and solve financial problems as well. And I think so far we've built a lot of this financial infrastructure and use cases on chain. And while I think that we're quite far, and many of these protocols like Aave has been quite successful so far, we're still quite away from actually getting full mainstream adoption where something like blockchain is used for everyday payment transactions, other types of financial transactions, and any type of value exchange. But I noticed that actually using the blockchain expands beyond financial use cases, and today we have significant amount of people in the planet actually using the internet in a way where we give a lot of data to companies, and we create connections, we create identities, but we don't really own these different types of on-chain, these different types of properties. And what it means is that we're relying on these bigger companies at the moment and grow and create the value towards these companies without being part of the value chain. And I think the potential beyond the financial use cases is far more bigger actually. And I think every person in the planet has this concept of social capital, meaning the identities, connections we create, the content we make, and we are doing this online all the time. So being able to take some of these properties and making them ownable by users has a lot of potential changing the way we create social spaces and making them more open and fair and on a shared network that drives innovation. And I think that's a really big problem to solve. And I think as we're building more infrastructure, we're getting closer towards a price point even where we can provide these products to consumer end users.
And so your solution to this is Lens, and I think it's so interesting because it kind of doesn't include the most obvious part of like what people think of when they think of social media. So describe what Lens is.
Yeah, the way I would say what Lens is, it's a shared social network. So developers build social applications or consumer applications in this common network. And the network consists of different types of properties that we use on everyday social. So when we join a social network, we create identities. That might be your account, username. Then we connect with other users, and that's called a social graph. And then we create also content. And also there's a part of that because we're using on-chain, it means that there's also ability to monetize with your distribution and network that you create. And we are using basically the blockchain to secure these properties. So meaning that they don't live in a database in any social app that is building on Lens, but they're basically on a distributed ledger accessible by you, and anyone can actually build. applications or build also algorithms as well. So take all the data that is available and build a new algorithm and serve users.
Yeah, and so it's just interesting because you provide this tech stack, but there's no application that's associated with your group. So there's kind of like an ecosystem that's being formed. And so if you were to kind of, envision ultimately what this ecosystem would look like, then what will social media be like for users someday once this is, a fully fledged out vision?
I think what Lens is trying to aim is to create user choice. And I think that user choice is really lacking at the moment when we think about social networks. And I do think building social networks is a very long game. And that's why it's such an interesting problem to solve, because there's a lot of time to actually iterate to these different models that we're building in this category. And the way I think about Lens is that now how we build Lens is that it is a shared social network and we don't have an application, but we wanted to leave the design space on application layer to third parties to come and build. And we've seen, for example, long-form content applications like D2, mobile-first applications like Orb, and many others actually building. And what's interesting here is that we're seeing kind of like a diverse set of applications living on top of the Lens protocol. And in the future, what we want to see is that we want to give even more choice for the users, how they control their data and how they share amongst these users. So the way we think about it is that Lens shouldn't be like a one network where, if you follow a user, that relationship is reflected amongst all these applications. But in fact, what we want to see is that each application can actually create their own user base and leave the decision for the user whether these relationships should be reflected across the whole network or application to application specifically. But the aim is eventually to create more open social spaces that are more fair, meaning that you are not locked with your follower base in one single application, and you can safely grow your network without being feared that some sort of change in terms and conditions that makes you want to leave the network, and you will essentially leave all your social capital behind. And we want to change that.
And so you launched in 2022, and there's about 400,000 users. And as you mentioned, there's this plethora of applications that have been built on top. And at that time, I guess you started on Polygon's POS chain. But recently, Lens announced the Lens Network, which is a layer 2 using ZK Sync and Validium's. So tell us more about Lens Network, why this is the next iteration of Lens.
One interesting thing we figured out while building Lens is that we built it very early, as you mentioned, Laura, in 2022. And for us, Polygon was the choice to actually build it because of the price point of transactions. And obviously, rollups were a relatively new concept back then. But the cost of the transaction is really fundamental for social transactions. So we want to use on-chain for securing some of these properties that are on Lens for the fundamental reason of data integrity. So what blockchain does really, really well is that it establishes data integrity. So what data is actually correct and what is incorrect, and then distributing that correctness across different nodes. Just to give an example is that, for example, if with on-chain or Lens or any other type of a blockchain application, once you finalize the block, you simply copy the whole state across all these nodes, meaning you have a guaranteed set of information that you can rely upon. And that's really fundamental when you think about censorship, ownership, and the social context. These are the things that doesn't really matter on the kind of like an end user angle because we will build the application layer in a way where a lot of these blockchain parts are abstracted away from the users, but fundamentally they're important to actually create these guarantees for the users. So when we use on-chain, we can provide these guarantees. And our thinking is that to scale towards mainstream, what we actually need to do now and in the future is that we have to get the price point of on-chain transactions and using that security at a lower cost. And to do that, we have to basically use on-chain in a way where we don't necessarily use the same security that we use for financial assets. For example, if we store value on Ethereum, or for example, inherit the security from Ethereum with L2s. And the way we think about it is that Validiums are a perfect solution for this, because we're using and submitting state transitions into Ethereum, but we're using a data availability for actually storing the state. And this significantly reduces the price, and that's acceptable for something like social, because these are not financial transactions, but enough security to secure identity, graphs, and similar types of use cases. And that's why I'm a big believer for Validiums.
And have you been seeing that price has been like hindering the growth of Lens so far?
Not yet, because we haven't launched yet, but once we...
Sorry, I mean the cost of transactions with the Polygon version?
Yeah, the biggest challenge now with what we see with rollups and let's say POS is that the cost is where we can actually maybe host 200,000 users monthly, 300,000 users monthly, but maybe not beyond that. So we already are hitting the ceiling of the cost in the current state.
Okay, and so what are your plans for rolling out Lens Network?
We're already testing internally. We're going to launch a testnet that publicly any developer can actually participate and see the magic of what actually Validium can do. And in the next 2 to 3 months, we're going to also have the mainnet release. And one of the things we want to do is focus also on really smooth developer experience. And one of my kind of like dream ideas is that if the cost of transactions is very low, maybe developers actually start observing the transaction cost for the users. And just to give an example, if you build a Web2 application today, you have certain bills, right? You have AWS bill, you're paying for other types of things that you're using to host your application. And you're not really directly passing that cost to the users. So our basically dream idea here is that if we can build with a lower price point, and developers can observe this cost by paying $50 or $500, depending how big of their application is a month, they don't need to pass that on-chain transaction cost or data availability cost to the users. They can just buy credits, and then abstracting also a lot of the UX complexity away from the users with account abstractions, embedded wallets, and paymasters, and effectively building on-chain apps in a way where they feel just like a normal applications and you don't feel the bottlenecks of the blockchain.
And would that be in perpetuity that they would pay, or that I'm sure there's a lot of companies that have during a period of adoption paid and then ultimately pass that on to the users?
I think it should be like a scalable model. So you can start an application even for free, or you pay $5 a month, and maybe you will have an application for 1,000 users. Then if you want to scale for 10,000 users, for let's say 100,000 users, you pay, let's say $100. And if you want to scale even further, you pay 500. And the pricing model could be something similar that we already are familiar. And why this is important actually is that we kind of have to create a little bit more familiarity for developers entering into the space to how to think and what's the mental model for the blockchain costs. And if they package in these types of models that already exist on when you're building and hosting traditional applications, it's far more easier for developers to approach. And if this tooling is also available, that you can have a paymaster, offer gasless, signless transactions. You basically have the whole infrastructure and everything ready here. And that's why I'm also really much excited about this phase, because I do think now the next couple of years we're going to see a lot of consumer blockchain-based applications being built.
And so everybody is looking to resolve, very similar problems, and there is a whole host of different offerings out there, and you've chosen ZK Sync and Validium's. Like, what was it about those two that you?
Well, one interesting thing about ZK is that EVM-compatible ZK rollups and EVM-compatible ZK VM has been progressed so far in the past couple of years. So I personally believe that this is a technology that was far more down the line, maybe 10 years. So that came relatively quickly. And from ZK Sync perspective, it's basically the only offering where you get a ZK EVM and a Validium at the same time. And that's really fascinating because you have the portability that EVM brings, which is really important because you don't need to write something from scratch. And then if you build, let's say, Lens protocol on Lens network, you can still have iterations or instances of Lens protocol on other networks as well, which is one writing of the code. And the Validium is incredible because that brings a price point that you get into a level where these transactions are more accessible for consumers. And down the line, Validium can be upgraded to something called Volution, which is essentially running a Validium side by side of a ZK rollup. So ZK rollup can handle more significant financial transactions, and then Validium handles all these social transactions with that require less security. And
so you're working toward launching this, and at that point, what will happen with Lens protocol?
Lens protocol, we have a new iteration, and what we're going to focus on is data control. So, you have portability today across all these Lens applications, which is amazing. So you create your profile once, and you can access to all these different apps being built on Lens. But in the future, actually, these applications will need to request permission to you to actually share the data. So what we kind of like want to enable is more user control over their data. And another aspect we're focusing on is the data privacy angle. So there's going to be a first level of data privacy from the node level where you can decide what you want to share across these different applications and the network. And then down the line, we will probably see more iterations of ZK proofs over a long-term horizon. And it's actually very interesting because not only ZK proofs can create privacy for the users without revealing the data, but it creates new types of social networking use cases when you don't need to reveal the data, but you can prove, for example, that you own something, or you have a certain amount of followers, or you can prove your location or even age. And that brings some very fascinating use cases.
Yeah, talk about that more. Wait, by the way, I'm so sorry to interrupt this, but I'm pretty sure this is supposed to go for 40 minutes, and the clock was set for 20. Can somebody just let me know if we're going over? Pretty sure it's supposed to be 40, and that the clock is wrong, but I just wanted to check.
Maybe someone will come and kick us out once we're done.
All right, then I'm going to keep going. So you talked about those interesting use cases. I mean, yeah, like right now we're just giving up all this data, and Facebook and Twitter and all these giant social media companies are making money off of that. So in this new future that you're building, like what will that look like? Like what does it mean that I could selectively reveal information, especially about my social media following? Like, I don't even know kind of what that means. Like, what could it enable me to do, or like how would I use that? Why would I use that?
Yeah, I think the fundamental challenge now is that all the data exists in the databases of bigger social media companies, and that's a fundamental issue because it means that while it might be data that we create, it might be our own networks, connections, our content. The fundamental issue, it's sitting on a place and actually in a way where these companies can actually use the data to whatever purpose that is. And the latest trend, for example, is to use the data to actually train these massive LLM algorithms, which basically means that these networks become actually even more accurate on predicting what you might like and how you could be actually, how to make use to stick with the network as much as possible. And that can be really dangerous. And the second kind of thing that we are living now is that we have a lot of, so one thing about Lens is that we use on-chain, but the actual data isn't really on-chain. So it's stored in agnostically either in IPFS, like a decentralized storage, or it can be on even AWS, still stored centrally, but the actual linking of the transactions is on-chain. So the next kind of like a mindset is that how we actually enable like the full ownership of the data. So even if you control primitives on chain and you have a shared kind of like a network and you store data on a public blockchain, it provides ownership, but the true ownership actually is when you can reject other third parties or the public using your data. And I think it's a really interesting kind of like a loop of closing the loop of ownership. And what I'm thinking is that we need to move into a model where you have, first of all, you have the choice to share data or not to share. And secondly, when you share, you have also the choice of actually monetizing that data. So maybe you actually want to participate and train some of these algorithms that might be useful for you, and you have enough information to understand, and they have enough transparency to read them, to train them for your own benefit, and maybe even earn doing so. So I think we kind of like have to move from a model where data is basically owned by social media companies into basically it's owned and also secured by the users, and they have the fundamental choice what they want to actually share with applications. And I think that's the kind of future I'm looking into.
So this past winter, we also saw that Farcaster kind of had a breakout moment when it introduced frames, which enables crypto transactions to happen just within any application, or at least on Farcaster. But as far as I understand, so Farcaster has this more like federated model where they're kind of aiming for sort of like a minimum amount of decentralization, and you have a very different philosophy. So can you explain, why it is that you've gone with that philosophy and how it differs from the Farcaster model?
I think it boils down to the fundamental ethos of like our team and how we think about decentralization, and we think about it more from participation and also security angle as well. So and this boils down to my kind of like a previous explanation that what blockchain really does well is create the data integrity, and that really means that, for example, if we've chosen a federated model, that will mean that potentially you have a system where you might have multiple servers, and then you can connect these servers to a network. Well, there's obviously different kind of challenges with synchronization, but one big challenge is that you might see like some of these servers becoming like the main servers, and kind of like that grabs all the data and serves to the users, and they become kind of data dictatorships. And there's a lot of interesting research actually about federated models and the risk they can actually create from this data dictatorship angle. And then the next kind of iteration could be that maybe you can copy the data across all the networks, and that depends on whether these servers actually want to do that. So you can incentivize them to copy the data, but that's that's no different than actually having a high SLA agreement with servers end of the day. And what federated model is missing is this kind of like a consensus over what data is right. And once you have that consensus, it means that everyone needs to replicate the data model. So it's effectively just an example is that if a federated server that has grown significantly big, if they get a subpoena to remove data, most likely they will have to do that because it's controlled by some party. Someone is running that system. But in blockchain-based model, what's interesting is that once you have a consensus over a data set, and because of the incentives, what happens is that all these nodes will replicate the data. And if a node will leave, it means there's going to be incentives for another node to join. And that fundamentally creates the security that you can then use and apply into different types of use cases and properties. And the most where we are actually applying it significantly, obviously, is in DeFi. So, or let's say just asset tokenization and securing like financial transactions and financial storage on Ethereum, as an example. And what I think is actually more interesting compromise or like a mental model is to think about, well, if you're able to derive this security model that provides these guarantees for the users, and it's really hard to break, then let's ask a question ourselves that how much of that security we actually need to what type of transactions. And then when you look at social transactions, there's kind of like you can see it in some way that social transactions don't need the same amount of security than storing billions of, for example, TVL in Aave. It might need just like a fragment of the security, but it needs some security. And that's why the Validium model, or even rollups and further Validium model works really well, because you can choose the level of security. And I think we're going to go from a model where you have to kind of like choose a category of security to actually you're going to have like a more of like a spectrum. For example, like maybe you have a social app that just needs enough security that you can have blockchain-based usernames that you can then trade. And usernames are traded all the time. Like obviously Telegram tokenized their usernames, but for example, you see a lot of companies buying Twitter handles and a bunch of other apps as well. In a bunch of other apps, as the same thing happens. And you can actually make this more secure and ownable, and that no one can actually take a handle away from you. And you can make it more efficient from kind of like the monetization and trading perspective. Then that's why I'm like fundamentally more excited about using on-chain where it's needed. And where you want to have security and data integrity, and then you can build everything around that. So maybe you have in your social apps, you're using the Lens usernames, but then your group chats are just database based because you don't need blockchain there necessarily.
And so I understand you're very focused kind of in this tech area and sort of the back end, or the tech stack. But of course, social media, as we've been talking about, is one of the biggest industries on the planet. Some of the biggest companies in the world are social media companies. So even though you're just providing this technology and you're letting all these different developers build apps on top, have you thought about how you're going to gain adoption? Because we have these like giant, I don't know if monopoly is the word, but these giant companies that already have so many users. There's a little bit of friction, or a lot of friction, to get people to move over to something new. So have you thought about how to make that happen? Yeah, and you're absolutely right in the sense that we've been focusing quite a lot on the infrastructure, and now kind of like focusing more on the maybe like so-called like UX infrastructure. So cheaper transactions, paymasters, removing gas fees, removing signing, making wallets easier, and basically getting it there. But fundamentally, what's going to be the most important is the application layer and what type of use cases actually we bring users. So do you think that
in overall, if you look at the whole kind of like a Web3 landscape, we're not even close to that type of an adoption, even if you look at DeFi at the moment. So I think DeFi itself will take a decade to get into like a actual like a bigger adoption from institutional side, and also like more globally. It's still really, really small area, and it has proven to some extent that it's getting more and more users. And I mean, big believer in DeFi because it's just better finance. It's better, faster, stronger finance, and Lens is the same way. It's just a better way of building social, and it builds more equitable and fair social spaces that users can govern as well. So I do think that it's really hard to think about like which exact application will create a breakthrough, but that has been always the case for social. TikTok, it took them few applications before figuring out which one is actually the one that is getting more traction, and I think that's how we should think about social. So we should actually make it as easy as possible to build social applications, and if they're building on a shared network, they can actually utilize the same user base. And the interesting thing is that if you would have seen like Clubhouse being built on a shared social network, even if that use case wasn't sticky and didn't have enough retention, someone else could actually build an app on the same network, and you would have a user base that are already used to audio, and you can keep iterating. And I think everything is about iterating. We'll never find the exact model right away, and it takes time and few iterations to find something that makes a breakthrough. And if it's built on a shared graph in a network, and it's easy, and there's incentives to do so, I think that's going to be fundamentally removing a lot of blockers in between.
And so the current business model of social media is such that the users provide the content, and then the platform in the middle makes all the money. And that is driven by advertising. But once your vision of what you're building is created, then will there be things like advertisers, or is it literally just people who own their data monetizing it kind of more directly with their users, or what does the business model look like?
Yeah, this is really interesting because I do think there's that fundamental problem now that you have a lot of monetization in social networks, like direct monetization. It's just going from the advertisers to platforms, and there is no transparency about what's being paid and what's and how the content is served, for example, for users, and why. These are like big questions and big problems. And I think that some of these Web2 social media applications, they do and are starting to share a little bit of revenue because they are competing for creators, and creators is a growing user base, and I think some of the more recent applications are creating content even more easier, so it becomes more interesting to become a creator and to actually monetize as well. And I do think that if we are able to make this whole monetization concept and more transparent, we can include the user more into the monetization supply chain. Even that basic whole idea of where there's attention, there is actually an opportunity, such as, for example, advertising. But I do think that there might be other types of models as well. So attention is just one thing. So everything that can actually be built on chain can be easily plugged into Lens. And that's really fascinating because that means that you can actually share revenue on all types of transactions. So I also believe in this idea that you don't need to actually go to a specific on-chain application to do an action and participate, but you could, for example, swap an asset on Uniswap directly on a social app that is built on Lens and share the revenue across the application, the discovery algorithm, the other users that you might to share the monetization. you can vote, let's say, directly on governance, on the feed. Maybe you want to cast a prediction on polymarket directly on Lens. So there's a bunch of interesting things that you can plug into a bigger ecosystem of Web3 and share that revenue. And that's all digital. So I do think that the design space will grow, and advertising probably is something that will happen everywhere where there's attention. But at least you can actually create a lot of transparency around that and actually even make some significant improvements on how to share those fees.
So one problem that we are seeing over and over and over and over and over again, especially in this airdrop era, is sort of like Sybil attacks. And in this world where people can monetize attention directly, or even, as you mentioned, there could still be advertisers involved, is there a way to prevent that kind of activity on Lens where, like, potentially somebody might, we see this already on Twitter where there's all these bots. Is there a way to prevent that type of activity? Or maybe people can't make money that way because I guess they'd have to, it costs money to do the bots, or I don't know. Like, do you have thoughts on, are there ways that could, the same problems we see in social media today could end up on Lens as well? Or are there ways that, this technology can prevent that?
Yeah, it's a really hard problem to solve, because even if you look at the more Web2 social media, that bot problem exists in a significant scale. And even after things like, for example, asking users to pay, we still see in social bots that actually are willing to pay a certain amount to create these different types of attacks or farms and whatnot. So it's a fundamental problem, and it's really hard to solve. But I do think that there's one aspect and one angle to solve it is through ML. And something we've seen recently is that since the Lens data is open, so anyone can build an algorithm. So we built one algorithm that effectively creates a reputation score across all these users on Lens, and based on their on-chain transactions on Lens and elsewhere, and some off-chain data as well. What's interesting here to see is that it's a really interesting way to find kind of like who are relevant users of the network, but also we see more and more sophisticated kind of like bots everywhere. And now when you have open source large language models, it actually means that you can run a model on your laptop, or if you get free GPU or low-cost GPU, and you can actually you can impersonate human really well. And that's a really big problem. So I think the way to think about this is it has to be solved in some sort of like a humanity angle and verification. That's one way to think about it. And when it comes to this farming and airdrops, that's another type of a problem, because that intensifies and amplifies the issue. And some sort of changes probably have to happen there, because these airdrops never meet expectations. So I think that's a model also that needs some sort of refreshment.
All right, well, we just have a couple minutes for people who are interested in Lens, whether they're developers or creators or just users. What would you recommend they do to get started?
I think getting familiarized with the documentation is the best place to start, and reach us out, our team, and we would love to discuss with developers. There's a lot of interesting stuff getting launched on the Lens network, and I'm happy to talk to anyone who is interested in building social or integrating social into something that they're already built. It's a really fascinating landscape, because I do think that social is bringing us more closer to consumer, and it's a very fun category to work upon.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.